And I'm not a prude about using a wide array of words to express myself in private conversation.
Amen to that.
Certainly, with other adults. But that signage really stopped me cold. And of course, I had to laugh a bit scornfully, I must say, when the last sign in that collection was the sign that said,
everyone, and welcome to a Generational Thing podcast. I'm your host, Natalia Latham.
And I'm your host, Angela Latham. And it's the holiday season. Yay! Whatever holiday or holidays you celebrate, there's just a vibe this time of year, a sense of capping everything off in party mode that, I don't know, goes down like a fine wine for me. So cheers, everyone.
Cheers to that. And speaking of holiday cheer, it would make all of us here at a Generational Thing podcast very cheerful if you gave us a follow on social media. You can find us at a Generational Thing podcast on Instagram, a Generational Thing podcast on Facebook, and a Gen Thing pod on X or Twitter if you're one of the real ones. And you can also send us an email at a generationalthingpodcast@gmail.com to just chit chat with us, send us a little something.
Yeah. We'll try to respond.
We sure will try.
and maybe if it's of general note, we might even bring it up on a future podcast. So
consider yourself lucky.
Anyway, today we're going to look at how place can shape a sense of self. In our case, that place, that tangible, location includes a lot of country living for both of us, what we affectionately call the backwoods. Truth be told, for about 5 minutes, we thought about naming this entire podcast Backwoods Forwards instead of a generational thing because of how much we feel shaped by our country roots, even though our worlds have expanded from the country. But the question remains, why the heck do a whole episode on essentially country girls always, except, of course, when we're not?
Well, this is because in the world of a Generational Thing podcast, we believe that authentic dialogue can truly be transformative, whether that's for good or for ill. But our focus primarily is on the former of those. And by authentic dialogue, we really mostly just mean that our words come from who we are in all the myriad of ways that we hold identity. Generational status and age, of course, is an identity emphasis here, but being good feminist women that we are, yes, of course, we also strongly believe in the impact of intersectionality. Thank you, Miss Kimberly Crenshaw.
Yes.
That is, that we are never only in our age or only in our race or class or educational status or religion or gender or really just any one thing. We're just all a big cluster,
Indeed.
So true. And yes, this shout out glosses over the many intricacies of intersectional theory. So once again, sorry, Miss Kimberly Crenshaw.
For the record, I want to say too that we both love cities, even suburbs, have lived in all the categories, frankly. Wherever you come from, though, and even if it's more than one place, we believe that the basic framework of using place as a reference point for identity is useful. And it's another great way to share stories, to create connections, and generate more understanding or compassion intergenerationally. By the end of this episode, we hope you'll agree with that assumption on our part.
And hey, if you don't, well, I guess us country girls will just have to make do because that's what a good country girl do. Okay. So let's get into it, Miss Backwoods country girl.
Indeed. Backwoods, you don't say.
Yeah, you don't freaking say. A lot of people don't say, actually. And I know that you and I have talked about how this is kind of a loaded word.
Yes.
And even though we kind of throw it around as a compliment, what word associations do you suppose that the average listener might have on this backwoods kind of thing?
Well, I think there are a lot of connotations in stereotypes in popular culture. Some words that come to my mind are, hicks, rubes, rednecks. Those are some of the, I think, ways that people associate backwoods with the kind of people who populate the backwoods.
Yes.
Are there any others for you?
Yeah, I feel like for me, one of the first things that comes up is just like lack of education or lack of culture, which, like, again, this is a stereotype. This is not necessarily what I believe, but that's definitely like a thing, you know. It's just
Sure.
assumed that, oh, you're not in touch with the ways of the world now because you're living in the
Right.
backwoods, girl,
Backwoods.
you
That's a
know?
good point.
Right.
Conservative politics is often, I think, an association people make with country folks. There's some other words that, it's sort of like a word association, not all of which are negative connotations, but I actually think the word beauty comes to mind as
Yeah.
an example of a positive connotation. A lot of people associate backwoods with, aesthetic views and so forth.
Yeah. I think also with beauty, charm, there's that charm, and kind of like, I know that you and I are not from the South, but there is like a Midwestern kind of charm, you know?
Sure. And I've lived in Texas too, and the form of backwoods that I see in Texas, I've thought as I've taken bike rides through some ranchish looking countryside, the word scruffy comes to mind. The trees are just so different than the Midwestern trees. But over time, there's this beauty I also associate with that.
Yes.
Certainly patriotism, I think of a lot of patriotism with association with country
Yes.
life.
And pride. Yep. Isn't it funny how we put hicks, rednecks, rubes, all that kind of stuff right alongside beauty and charm and earth and patriotism.
Right. And I think of words come to mind like, animals or God, religion. But there's so many contradictions, I guess, is what we're getting at just in this quick wordplay about one of the concepts we talked about in prepping was this rural aesthetic. You mentioned rural charm, but there's a really hard to define sense of place that I think you and I share because of where we come from, that comes through, though, the experiences we've had and memories and people that come to mind first when we think about whatever we call home, which in and itself can be a complicated term, but in the sense of home as backwoods, as we're talking about today. So what are some of those top of mind images or memories that might help convey what backwoods means to you personally? I'm really interested in that.
Yeah, I feel like I can't really answer this without first mentioning something that you and I had talked about whenever we were kind of riffing on the idea of like not only just like the visual things that we see, but also just like the vibes, you know?
Yeah.
And like the feeling that kind of washes over us whenever we first get off the interstate and turn on to the state road, you know?
Right.
It's like an instant kind of vibe switch. And to me, it kind of feels like leaving civilization, but not really like in a bad way. It's just kind of like a time travel-y kind of sense. And it's just, it's a strange thing that I feel like you just, if you know, you know. But some images that come to mind for me are that of my dad playing the piano at our little church of 8 to 12 people on a good day. That is 8 to 12 people. And images of walking down what we like to call County Line Road. Line Road.
Known that road most of my life. Yep.
Yeah, definitely. With the dogs just like running free around us in the cornfields, And I feel like I have a southern drawl coming out whenever I'm talking about this.
I hear it, and I find the same thing happens to me when I get close to that place.
Right.
And also when I come back from that place, people detect it in me. So perhaps it's going to creep in here as we talk about that place.
And I love that for us, girl. But maybe we should talk to our therapist about that. But also some images of like our whole family gathered around the table with a bowl of grandma's chili to watch Jeopardy or the news or just be together and stuff like that. And those are the things that really come to mind for me first. And a lot of that kind of arouses this sense of like melancholy and nostalgia in me now.
Yeah.
And just thinking about like how whenever I was still living at the farm, living at home with my parents, things just felt much more simple and peaceful. And I wish I would have acknowledged that at that point in my life. Now that I'm a working girl, living in the
a big
city.
city.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, it's funny how you use the phrase the farm, so named and called by Lathams for over 100 years now. There's such a rich and specific set of meanings, though I think for each generation, your use of the word the farm and what that conjures for you is different than my own. And by the farm, we're talking about maybe 100 acres of mixed tillable and forested land.
Yeah, farmland and hunting land and campground and all that kind of stuff.
It's not, this is not a factory farm. This is a long time generational.
Actually, a farm with literally no animals on it, actually.
Those animals used to be a dairy farm, actually, when my dad was living there as a young man. So there's all kinds of levels to this. So, but I was thinking about your bedroom in the house that was built by your great grandfather. It was in the 1950s. That space there, narrowing down this idea of place and space to even just that spot for me. I think of the memories of you as a teenager when I was visiting, my mother, who lived with you, and she would be there and we would talk together while you were sleeping away on a Saturday morning. And we would try, you may not have known this, we tried not to be too loud to wake you up. It may not have seemed that. But then in that very same room, I have memories of, great grandpa Latham for you, who loved to be in that same space many, many years ago when I was a little girl, doing his fiddling around with the old family photos, putting them in albums that he would share with the family. He'd always write these crazy little notes on things and then give them to us. And, so that sort of creative space, like office, but not where he did the kind of work you'd think of as an office. He did creative work for himself and for the family. So, just the layering there of generations and the place the memories of place that house holds and that one room are really meaningful.
Yeah. And if I may add, also a couple of other things that come to mind for me are the huge barn that we have on the farm with all of its, as my dad once called it, memorabilia stuck inside of it, and our yard's full of junker cars, and not only just our yard, but that seems to be just a regional thing, just these huge Indiana sunsets and my dad selling firewood and those kinds of things.
Sure. And my dad, when he and my mom were the next generation that lived, before your dad started and your mom and you started to live in that house, and that as the primary residents and caretakers of the place. Before that, Dad was always tinkering in that barn. He had a workshop there, and he would often take my son with him, and they spent hours in that barn and would try to fix up one of those junker cars or maybe a junker tractor, and that or maybe fiddle around with fishing tackle or plan an escape to the lake to go fishing. So just that sense of place and all the layers of meaning and memory and generation that are attached to that, and then become a part of our identity, just as they inhabit our memories.
Yes, definitely. I'm loving all the memories that's coming up for us, talking about just the farm, the farm incorporated. And that also, like, you're talking about like this fishing tackle of grandpa's, that makes me think about how whenever I was, I don't know, like 6, 7, 8 years old, he would always take me hunting for minnows.
Bait.
Yeah. And I feel like I remember that milk house like being solely dedicated to all of his fishing gear at one point in my childhood. And I just love that, because I even like I didn't really get to know my grandpa all that well before he passed away. I just know fishing was such a huge, important thing for him.
Right.
And if that ain't a good Indiana homegrown boy for you, then I don't know what is.
Right. And if only we had a third mic in this pod, we would
summon the spirit of Grandpa.
Well, or the boy Grandpa did that for my son too.
Yes, for
Braden. The idea of the hunting minnows, and that milk house was in fact a very important spot, and behind which they would they would do the fish prep after they'd caught some fish. So anyway,
right. Maybe we'll have to have Braden, my dear
Yes.
cousin Braden, be a guest on the pod soon.
Yes, once we can afford that third mic.
I know, right? But at the same time, talking about all of this, now that I'm older and a bit farther removed from all of that, some of those words that we mentioned earlier, like, we were talking about patriotism and poverty and pride and all of these things that are stereotypical of the backwoods, really come to the forefront of my mind whenever I think about how I conceive of the backwoods now, the quote unquote backwoods I come from now. And that simple and peaceful kind of vibe of life really isn't so simple and peaceful for me anymore. For example, on either side of the state road where the farm is located, on one side, as you're coming, there is how do I even describe this? A myriad of different signage that is very anti Joe Biden, very pro Donald Trump. And we will definitely include an image of this, probably censored, on our social media. So definitely go follow us to check that out. But there's that just monument to bigotry on one side. And then on the other side, after you pass the farm, there is a newly erected monument with Jesus Christ kneeling on one side and a soldier kneeling on the other side with a huge sign in the middle that says, "Nothing is free without bloodshed." And it's just really disheartening to me that I literally cannot leave or come from or anything my family house without passing either of those on either side.
I haven't yet seen, except in the picture you showed me, the monument to nothing free without bloodshed.
Because I had to send you a picture of that.
Exactly.
I literally had to.
and yet it's somebody's front yard.
Yeah.
And I know the people. I mean, I knew their parents at least. And it's really, well, yeah, it's a lot to invest. As I could tell, it was more like a monument out of stone. What am I right on that? It's not just a sign. It's like a
it looks like a monument that you would find in like a cemetery.
Right.
It's definitely like a
gravestone.
Nice, yes.
Wow, maybe there's a reason for that. Well, and I know I did visit last spring, and like I said, I haven't seen that latest addition to the neighborhood. But when I did visit, I thought how things have changed in that part of the world where anybody, no matter who it was, that I felt like I'm getting back to your thought on how there's a sadness, there's a nostalgia, there's a darker sense to some of this now as we've moved out of those places and we look back and we also see the changes that continue to happen there. And, what people that I grew up with would have ever allowed kids passing by in a car to see signage that says, "Fuck anybody." That's like those signs do, no matter what the personal politics might be. And I'm not a prude about using a wide array of words to express myself in private conversation.
Amen to that.
Certainly, with other adults. But that signage really stopped me cold. And of course, I had to laugh a bit scornfully, I must say, when the last sign in that collection was the sign that said, "Jesus is my savior. Trump is my president." And, put together in context with all that hateful signage, I was, let's just say that, we've touched on religion a few times here, and the sense of, not being really believers in the same way that we were raised to be. But let's just say I'm still grieving a lot of things that I've discovered about my religious heritage and the roots that I come from over the past few years, for sure. And that was in some ways a monument for me. I'm not saying that's nothing like our family, our preacher dads would have ever put out or anything. I'm not equating that with the way we were raised, but
no, definitely.
In the sense of being from the backwoods and the sort of charm and the mindset of really a lot of kindness and community and helping one another, that just flies in the face of a lot of what my sense of backwoods growing up was. But it does feed into, I think, some of the more popular stereotypes that have started to increase now,
Right.
unfortunately, which we're here to, give some nuance there, folks. But anyway.
At a Generational Thing podcast, we love nuance, okay? But with that, there's just like this underlying yet obvious feeling of unwelcomeness whenever I see stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think there's like that feeling that if you think any differently than the larger redneck, respectfully, majority, and I just hate that feeling whenever I'm just trying to go home to visit my family and just, not have to worry about this extreme nature of political, what feels like to me oppression,
Mm-hmm.
At least from my perspective. But anyway, the amount of times I've wondered if these people have any cameras set up in their driveway, and the amount of times I've considered just ripping that shit off the fence, I can't even begin to tell you how many times that's crossed my mind. It's a complicated thing for me to think about now. I still feel a lot of pride in the way that I grew up, where I did, and how I did, and the way that influenced the way that I feel strongly about things like justice and community and feeling close to nature and just loving this old-fashioned aesthetic, this rustic aesthetic of country living. It's just really disheartening for me to think about how that is so equated now.
Right. And we started off some of this by saying, the contradictions. So I think we're right in the territory we said we were going to be in with these mixed feelings. But for me, backwoods is somewhat, but not totally literal. I love actually being in the woods, wooded spaces. I'm reminded of the musical Into the Woods, which has these themes of, being afraid at the front part of that musical by Stephen Sondheim. There's this sense of, into the woods, and it's a dark place and we're afraid to go there. But by the end of the musical, there's a sense of celebration and coming out and what you've gained by your foray into the darkness and all of that. Well, a lot of those themes resonate with me. And so I think that's kind of also another work of art, to an aesthetic aspect to bring into the conversation, since it's probably a pretty well-known musical, but if not, you get the idea. A lot of my own time in the woods, though, comes from years of just, being out there. For example, it was a family tradition going back to at least my grandparents, your great-grandparents, of hunting morel mushrooms every spring.
Yep. And... You mushroom fiend.
Yes. I would make the trek back to the family farm, and, it was at least 20, 30 years of my adult life every spring,
Yes, I know. So that's such like an important memory of you for me. Around April or May, it was like, it's time for Angie to come visit because it's mushroom hunting season. And I remember going out there with you a lot too. And I don't ever recall if I was really a good mushroom hunter myself, but I would like to think that I was taught by the best. So
well, I would like to think that too. But I have missed many a mushroom. I'm sure I've it's a whole art form. Those of you who are into morel mushrooms, which may be like 5 people listening, I don't know. Look it up. It's a big thing with some people. But anyway, it was a family tradition, as I said. And of course, Braden learned that. And it was just so beautiful to be out in the forest. It was kind of a good excuse to be out there anyway, as the first signs of spring are coming out. But to find these little, what actually are culinary delicacies, they can, if you get, you can sell them for quite a lot of money. I never found enough that I was willing to give up on, but they just pop up before you. They're so mysterious. So that's just one example. So my sense of backwoods includes the real place, the woods. And I think that being in the woods a lot, mushroom hunting or otherwise, has given me a sense of scale in the world in a way that crowded places don't or haven't for me. The vastness of space and the grandeur of nature. I've learned how to be alone and to find solace and solitude through allowing myself being quiet in what could seem a strange place, a place of lots of noises that you can't recognize and animal sounds. When you learn to accept that that solitude that you can get like in almost no other place, and get that in wooded areas. It's really it's a lesson that I've carried into many aspects of my life in troubled times and
definitely.
so forth. But I do like this sense too of being close to origins of things, of crops before they're processed, of vegetables growing in the ground, not just something you find in a grocery store. And I think with that metaphor in mind, I've learned the idea of growing and planting. I have learned a lot about blooming where I'm planted.
Yep.
There's a lot of examples I give that, but I don't want to take the time. But I have learned how to make do in a lot of different circumstances.
Because that's what a country girl do.
Yeah. Well, it certainly, for example, has helped me a lot in my career teaching in underfunded public colleges and universities. So that's just one way in which that skill has been applied. But on the other hand, there's a country aesthetic for me that has nothing to do with the woods, like the homespun quality that is often prevalent when you look around country places. Maybe the clearest example of something like that for me is I always remember this full size, by which I mean probably like 3 or 4 feet wide and whatever the proper proportions of a flag would be deep. But a flag hanging in the VFW that for the veterans of foreign war is a common type of gathering place in small country towns, especially. But in that town where I graduated from high school, it's a crocheted work of art in all colors. It hangs outside the men's and women's bathrooms. We'll have to post a picture of that too. It's just, it's really sweet. Things like that say so much about the way life is and how much pride, we've used that word a lot, and care that people are willing to invest in, decorating or putting something meaningful in even the nooks and crannies, if you will, of the spaces they inhabit and that they treasure. So.
Oh my God, yes. Literally tell me about that. I get that because I was just thinking about this the other day as I was preparing the notes in my bedroom, and I was just like, wow, I really am an eclectic girly, aren't I? It's like if I feel like there's like a single empty space on any of my walls, I'm like, no, something has to go there, But if I may just really quickly take it back to where you're talking about this sense of solitude that you find in the woods, this is making me think about one of the last times that Braden came to the farm. My cousin Braden, your son Braden. Yep. Hey, Braden. He was telling me about there was this tree in the woods on the Latham farm, that he said like Grandpa had taken him out to a few times whenever he was younger, and I guess Grandpa would like pray at this tree because there was. I hope I'm not butchering the story. Braden, let me know if you're listening to this. But like this tree, like it had a very low hanging branch, like on the ground basically, and it was perfect to just kind of kneel at and pray and like reflect,
Yeah.
And I just find that I was just this, we're all about intergenerational connections here, right? So I was like, wow, how interesting is it that it's not just you, but it's also Grandpa that feels the same way about the woods, and I find that same feeling there as well too. So just wanted to share that little story because I thought that was really precious. But
That's a lovely story, and I do know that that's something that my dad always or often talked about was the way the woods had such an impact on his mental health over his life. He didn't use that phrase,
right?
But I know now that's what he meant.
Yes.
So, yeah, that's beautiful.
Miss Girl, well, now that we've talked about the aesthetics, if you will, of the backwoods, I'm wondering if you could maybe please share a piece of art or literature that you feel captures the essence of your meaning of the backwoods.
That's hard. I sit here in my Willie Nelson t-shirt in honor of this episode. There's so many choices. He would be one. Lucas Nelson, his son, Lucinda Williams, many country singers, Johnny Cash, Jason Isbell, Alison Krauss. Oh, I could go on. I do like country music. It's not the only music I like, and I don't like all of it, but that's, and don't even get me started on quilting as an art form. It has such deep roots in country settings. But the thing I thought about many years ago, this poem came to me, and I've always felt it resonated especially well as a part of my sense of country life and my identity as a country person to some extent. Even though I didn't spend all my time doing this, the title of the poem is called Girl on a Tractor, written by Joyce Sutphen. And I'm not going to even read all of it. I know it's not proper to cut up a poem. Believe me, I've been taught that, but I just basically want to quote a few lines from it so that I can focus in on the part that resonates the most with me and know that people can read that on their own, the whole thing. But anyway, the lines that say, I learned to drive a tractor at just the right speed so that two men walking on either side of the moving wagon could each lift a bale, walk towards the steadily arriving platform, and simultaneously hoist the hay onto the rack, walk to the next bale, lift, turn, and find me there exactly where I should be, my hand on the throttle, carefully measuring out the pace. When I read that poem, it brought back to me this sense of something I did as a girl was to drive the tractor for the hay wagon. And your dad and his brother, my brother, those guys were older than me. I would be the one on the tractor. They would be the ones picking up the bales. And I've connected that as a real important learning experience, both of a sense of agency and power in the sort of operations of a farm that I learned doing some of that. But then I remember how later it's like I learned a stick shift basically I already kind of knew how to drive with gear shift. And so that was one thing. But then as a mother of a young baby, I remember how I would try to keep the car from coming to an abrupt stop at a stoplight or whatever, because it was so great to have a sleeping baby in that car seat. So I just became a master of the stopping without any way to detect that you've actually stopped a car. So anyway, that's a sort of silly thing maybe, but it's just how your life connects and overlaps, even just certain things that you learned that maybe don't seem that important at the time, but then they come back in interesting ways. You apply those skills. So yeah, that's what about you, country girl? What comes to mind for you?
Country girl, what say you?
Yeah.
Well, I wish it was that simple for me, but I just could not think of only one. So if I may, there are two that I really think capture this feeling that I have, juxtaposition of a feeling that I have about what the essence of the backwoods is for me. Because there's something so romantic that I see about like rural country living. But then there's also something so painful about growing up in a very rural area. And there's a lot of things within that, like it's not just the way of life, but, socioeconomic, racial, any kind of ism, really. But one of the first things is Chemtrails Over the Country Club by my girl, Miss Lana Del Rey. And I choose this because I think that this song really captures the romanticism of what it is that comes to mind for me whenever I think about my experience of growing up in the country. And of course, country club. I don't know if I really call Latham Farm a country club, but I wanted to just talk about how it's the romance in this song. And the romance in the freedom of just rural life, I feel like, is what really does it for me. And I just wanted to quickly select some lyrics from this song. I'm on the run with you, my sweet love. There's nothing wrong contemplating God under the chemtrails over the country club. It's beautiful how this deep normality settles down over me. I'm not bored or unhappy. I'm still so strange and wild. And there's just so many things within that I feel like it's kind of hard for me to put into words, but especially whenever I was trying to really think about what it is about this song that really captures that for me as well. It's the I'm not bored or unhappy. I'm still so strange and wild. I feel like a lot of people think that there is there's a boredom. The slow paced way of life in the country can get very boring. but I'm not bored and I'm not unhappy because something about that has made me this strange, quirky, wild thing, if that makes any sense at all. But that's my first choice, chemtrails over the country club, chemtrails over
Okay.
Latham Farms.
All
But
right.
the other thing that comes to mind for me is this painting from 1948 titled Christina's World by Andrew Wyeth. And we'll also post this in our social media for y'all to go check it out, But I found this article by I believe her name is Despoina Soli for thecollector.com. It's titled Andrew Wyeth's Christina's World, A Closer Look. And one of the things that she said was, the work invites the viewer to a mysterious pastoral scene introduced by the curved figure of a young woman and sets the tone for a heartfelt story about human endurance and strength. And I think it's the human endurance and strength in this that really speaks to the the rough and tumbleness, the scruffiness of the backwoods. There's something about that that's so beautiful, even though it's difficult,
Mm-hmm.
And there was also a quote in this article from Andrew Wyeth himself where he said, if in some small way I have been able in paint to make the viewer sense that her world may be limited physically, but by no means spiritually, then I have achieved what I set out to do. And it's the limited physically, but by no means spiritually that really resonates for me because I feel like especially as women in this region of the country, there is like something that you feel limited by. In my experience, at least, being a young woman, there are things that, have not progressed necessarily at this point in the country for young women in rural areas. Yet that does not mean that my spirit is crushed because of that, And I just love that shit, okay? If y'all haven't seen the painting, I think that you'll definitely get it. It's really beautiful and really, there's a feeling that just washes over you.
So I think we've well established what backwoods means to us. But the title of this episode is Backwoods Forwards. So what about the forwards part of our journey? Neither of us is still just or only a country girl, much as we are in our hearts, as previously indicated. But why do you think that is? What compels us out of the woods, so to speak?
Yeah, I think for me, it was really, I think it was the desire to chase my dream to be on the silver screen. No, but kind of seriously, there is some truth to that.
Oh.
When I was thinking about this, I think that there is something to be said about feeling the need to be visible after hiding behind the trees for so long, if you will. Yes, hiding in the forest, into the woods. But I hope that this doesn't come across as vain in any way, but there was always a feeling there was just so much more for me and my abilities and what I felt like I was able to achieve beyond the comfort and seclusion of the backwoods in the country,
Yep.
And honestly, I feel like you, Miss Angie girl, I feel like you played a big part in this for me too. Because I watched you be my cool aunt from Chicago. And honestly though, and I really admired you for this way that you embraced the big city life. And I still do admire you, obviously.
Wow.
But I was just like, this girl, she can really do anything. And it just seeing you embrace this big city life, that just made you so cool to me, And it's not like I was trying to, chase after your coattails or anything, but I think that you really inspired me to follow this dream of being in theater, and then after not only just theater, but just the world of the arts in general. And I think that really is something that I just saw was not available to me in this small town that I come from,
That makes sense. Yeah. Well, and I would have to say that that's part of what compelled me out too, is, a bigger world with more diversity, artistically, ideologically, and so forth. That's very sweet of you to say that. But I would also just say that's, again, part of this idea of generational conversation and relationships between people of different generations, related or not, because I have to say that, people that also were models for me of how to navigate a larger world, to come from a very specific place with its parameters and to find a way to transition out of that and explore a broader world. That nobody does that without, it's a community effort, or at least there's one or two other people who facilitate that or who help encourage that. And so I appreciate that, but I certainly wouldn't take all the credit. In terms
you
of,
should.
You're silly, but I do, feel with you the idea of getting out into a bigger world. And I've now had a lifetime of moving in and out of different spaces, country to city, as I've indicated. I've learned a lot, though, by having to adapt while keeping my core self intact. And in many ways, I feel a sense of not really belonging anywhere anymore fully now, either the city or the country. And this is kind of an embodied thing, down to even the clothes on my back. I've mentioned in previous episodes, I think at least once or twice, my love of fashion, and you've mentioned the word eccentric or eclectic. And, I feel those same descriptors about my own sense of style. And I never know how to dress to please myself and yet not look so far off the charts that I draw unwelcome attention. It's a much bigger issue than that in terms of responding to the notion of, what compels us out into the bigger world. But that's just sort of a small example. Suffice to say, I've always had the sense that my country friends could never imagine me in the city, and vice versa. My city friends probably wouldn't well imagine me in the country. I'm kind of a shapeshifter.
Yep. I definitely get that feeling of being a shapeshifter. I'll tell you that right now. But I feel like that for me comes more so in like a psychological and like physiological way, if that makes sense.
Say more.
And I would love to say more. Being theater girls, I know that you and I know something about performance and performativity and all of those things. And I feel like being able to authentically perform quote unquote bumpkin and quote unquote townie can be something of a gift. And I feel like for me, that also speaks to the feeling I'm not really being able to fit in or belong anywhere anymore. This, like I said, like this authentic performance of bumpkin and townie, if we want to call it that, like that does come from a place of truth. But then again, it's like I'm feeling like I have to be that way, or I don't know, like not on such a deep level, but I feel like I have to like be that way depending on what crowd I'm around, whether that's friends I've made through school, or, family, friends back home, neighbors, people at church, anything like that. It's like, depending on where I'm at, I kind of have to feel the vibe out and shapeshift accordingly,
Right. Right. So being the bumpkin sometimes and the townie at other times, as you adapt as well to different contexts. Is that kind of what you're getting? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And again, it's not like it's inauthentic. Like, I can, I bumpkin and townie is me, like that. The both of those I feel like can describe me at any given point. But it's just depending on where that feels appropriate to be,
So shape-shifting, like we were saying, shape-shifting.
No, literally. I'm confident that you and I are not alone in some of the things that we are saying. And I feel like it's natural to feel a connection to place, especially a place or places that comprise of a sense of home. And I'm thinking now about the people that we look to for inspiration, like I said, you being an inspiration of mine, of course, and who have forged a path through the woods, if you will, and into the clearings, if you will. Got lost a time or two, or even had to sacrifice a lot for not staying put and, being good little girls or whatever you want to call it. So let's talk about some of the quote unquote country girls we admire. Some backwoods women who really propelled themselves forward.
Sure. Yeah, I gave this some thought, obviously, in advance. These don't just roll off the top of my head because there are so many, as with other areas that we've talked about, there are lots of things you can go to when a question like that is posed. I'm going to start with one woman who I think of as a country girl raised in, well, she was born in Ripon, Wisconsin, a small town, and then, well, it was then, and then she grew up most of her time in rural Iowa. She founded the League of Women Voters, and her name is Carrie Chapman Catt. She was born in 1859, lived in 1947. But if any of you are not familiar with the League of Women Voters, it's a very important organization that is nonpartisan and does very vital work today that's so important in increasing voting access and engagement throughout the United States. So I just think of that. That's a forward-looking backwoods woman who is still being felt to this day, and I just really admire that. There's another woman on a very different side of things, just trying to think broadly here. There's a young woman that I really admire who is a comedy writer for Jimmy Kimmel Live. And she's a performer like us, but her name is Blair Erskine, and she may be familiar to some folks listening. She got to be really well known on social media during the pandemic, especially, but she grew up on a sod farm in Georgia. And then when, she trained as, I think, an actress, and I don't know all of her bio, but she applied her acting performance skills to parodies of characters and would present different viewpoints on news events of the time, especially, like I say, during the pandemic, where she presented herself as an authentic character, giving some commentary on what just happened in the news as, one of the people who had participated in. It was very parody focused, and she fooled a lot of people. A lot of people got embarrassed by saying, "Oh, should she really think that?" The way social media is so critical. And yet she would just like, "Oh, gotcha." I really think she's a lot of fun, and I admire her as a country girl who's moved forward, and her, she can be checked out if you are interested on Instagram, Blair Erskine it's at BLAIRE.ERSKINE. You can put that in the notes, but just so you have it. So that's a couple for me.
I remember you briefly mentioning Blair Erskine to me one time whenever I went to go visit you in Texas, and you showed me one of the videos that she had posted on Instagram, and I was like, yeah, this girl's on it. She knows.
Well, obviously Jimmy Kimmel Live decided she was a good enough writer to join his staff. So she's in the big leagues now. Yeah.
But one country girl that came to mind for me was Little Miss Dolly Parton.
Yes,
the literal queen of country music.
Wow, yes.
Being that she was born in a one-room cabin in Tennessee to a family that she has just self-described as dirt poor, and I just really admire the way that she's very upfront about how people perceive her and her artificial look. But whenever I was reading up on her a little bit, I don't remember the quote exactly, but she was like, "You can look at me and tell me that I'm inauthentic, but if you talk to me, I'll tell you what, I'm the real thing." That's not what she said exactly, of course, but that was the sentiment, right?
Oh, she is so beloved. But saying things like that, she just is so fresh in the way she says things, and and she's so generous too. The kinds of contributions she's made, charitable contributions. She's just an amazing woman. And I just, when Betty White died, I thought, well, Dolly Parton's the new queen of good feelings all around.
I know.
She was already the princess, in waiting.
You told me a brief little story about how Grandpa was quite fond of her too. Remember that?
Not that he ever met her or even dreamed of it, but it's so funny because when we were kids, there would be, when we got a TV eventually, that we're allowed to, there would be country music shows that came on, and Dolly Parton would come up, and anytime that she'd be on, he was always attended. He loved watching this. This is a preacher, a very conservative church, and lots of rules about women not wearing jewelry and makeup and dressing modestly. I grew up with all of that stuff, and here's this woman in all her splendor and her voluptuousness, and boy, he was just all eyes. And it got to the point where my mom noticed that happening, and she had a good sense of humor about it, and she would tease him. So I might not have even noticed if at least until I got older. But she drew attention to it, but in a joking way. So it just sort of and he would just grin and, kind of,
Well,
he didn't argue the point. He just kind of looked sheepish about it. So.
Yeah, I know that this is another woman that you and I have talked about and is very important to us personally.
Sure.
But Miss Madge Oberholzer is a woman who comes up for us, being that she really is kind of just like us in a way, isn't she?
Well, there's a lot of overlap, let's just say, in terms of specific, talking about this being about where you come from and places you come from. She comes from where we come from and I should say. But yeah, Madge Oberholzer, lots of connections for us geographically, but also slightly family-wise. And she was born in Clay City, which is where I graduated from high school. She also has a slight family connection back at the level of 2 or 3 generations before any of us, right? but much more related. I really came to know of her because of one of my dearest friends. Was, I think, a second cousin or something to her, but a direct cousin a direct cousin to her grandmother, something like that. And so I learned about Madge. Eventually I learned there was a slight family connection to the Latham family as well, but that's neither here nor there really in terms of her importance. It's so much about
it's so much more than that.
She came, from the places we've been talking about, but ultimately had a huge impact on Indiana's politics and racial justice. She died very young because, and we'll get into a few of the details, but please know that we can't possibly give her enough credit. And it's a fascinating story, a very sad, tragic story that you can find a lot more about if you look her up and Google her, from Wikipedia to a really wonderful book that you and I both discovered and read thoroughly this summer, didn't we?
Yeah, that you shared with me. You actually gifted it to me, I believe, was it a graduation gift?
Oh, it was one of those. I don't remember. It might have just been, you got to read this. But
I feel like it was a graduation gift. I'm not entirely sure. But yes, you and I both shared this experience of listening through Audible.
Yes. Fever in the Heartland by Timothy Egan. And that's one of the most comprehensive, really carefully researched accounts that I'm aware of, although there have been some documentary series and things.
It sounded like she was also a very independently minded young woman who moved to Indianapolis and attended Butler University for 3 years at college. And at the age of 28, she was the manager of the Indiana Young People's Reading Circle. All that just goes to say that she was interested in the community. She crossed paths with D.C. Stevenson, leader of the, is it the Grand Dragon? Is that what the term is?
He was the Grand Dragon of the Indiana clan. Of the Indiana clan.
The Grand Dragon of the Indiana Ku Klux Klan. And we can't really even begin to get into all of the ways that he was a horrible, awful, evil human being.
He tortured her and raped her and, was violent with her. But then she was so desperate to escape the situation, knew she couldn't, was so harmed by him that she did try to poison herself, but did not succeed. And when she was eventually rescued, she lived long enough to write a full, or to, narrate and have transcribed.
To testify. Yes. To testify as to what he had done to her.
Right.
Yeah.
And her testimony was read posthumously at his trial.
Right.
It's a very complicated, multi-layered story, many phases to what all happened that are so interesting because you learn about the history of Indiana and the history of the KKK and its rise, second rise, not just, in the 1800s, but then it came back in the 20s, especially Indiana and some of the Midwestern states were very, very strong KKK holding places where they held power. And so anyway, he had been almost invincible. He had achieved a lot of political power in the state and was able to get by with life. He had actually done this kind of thing to other women, not maybe as extreme, but he continued to get by with his crimes, but was
right. And
protected.
it had always been brushed off because it seemed like he had a connection to literally any and every single level of power in Indiana, whether that be political or just social even.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so it felt like he was unstoppable. But what I so admire about this story, and as tragic as it is, here's this young woman, very powerless, and, came from our county in Indiana, who eventually went to the city, was trying to create a career for herself, make a name as a do-gooder in some ways. She was helping children in communities learn to read. It was part of a statewide program that she was helping manage. And then, to be spotted by him because she happened to have, a sort of government-related job, and she was at a government function for the state of Indiana. And then, ultimately sort of sacrifice herself because to out him and have him proven in a court of law to be who he was led to his downfall. And ultimately, the entire clan collapsed. I mean, there's still, of course, racism, and I'm sure that there's been rise in white supremacy as there has in so much of the world in recent years. But at that time, they lost their political power.
All because of this country girl.
Right. So, talk about backwoods and forwards. She's to me, she's who I would like to say is one of our greatest representatives for somebody who's really changed, had a big impact. And I think for me, the story resonates. If you read that book, particularly the part of the story that it's not even just the storyline, it's so much about of the quality of the story has resonance today, and looking at sort of, strong men, autocratic leaders, people who think they can get by with whatever they do. And, there's this couching of, what they're doing is right. Because, the Klan was well known for preaching about their, God and country and being for all the right things. But, underneath was this evil, dark, cruelty at root that it just took a long time to expose. But, I just think there's a lot of those kinds of themes that are running through some of the narratives of our own political life and our own national story. Even again, unfortunately, these things keep rising up.
Right.
Wow. What a journey.
Wow. What a freaking journey.
So here,
but we made it.
There's always so much more to be explored. It's just, identity is such a tricky thing. And as we've said, the sense of self comes from all different kinds of directions and places, right?
So true, girl. And like we said earlier, we're all really just one big cluster.
Yeah. Well, speaking of closing out, I think it's time, and I'm going to sign off and say how much I've enjoyed our chat again. And
as always,
we all look forward to the next time. And
until next time, I'll pray for you, girl.
All right. And happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Love you.
I love you too. Bye.
Bye.